Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial and our new theatre. My name is Tom Rogers and I'm a historian here at the Memorial. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. This afternoon, we are excited to welcome author Tom Trumble to discuss his latest book, Survival in Singapore, published this year, that considers the Allies' daring raid on Singapore, Operation Jaywick, and its brutal consequences for the civilian population. Before we start, however, I ask that you please observe the following courtesies for the comfort and safety of all visitors. Please be aware that food and drink, except for water, are not permitted in the theatre or in the memorial's galleries. Please take a moment to switch your mobile phones to silent and any other devices to silent. Fire exits for this theatre are located at the rear of the room on both sides. And in the case of an evacuation, please follow instructions by memorial staff. The bathrooms are located outside of these doors here, on your left as you're exiting the theatre. Turn left past the cloaking desk. Memorial staff will be happy to provide further information and assistance if required. Now, Tom's talk this afternoon is part of the Memorial's ongoing program of events this year, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. This program has included free monthly author talks. The final one is today. A session of the play 21 Hearts, Vivian Bullwinkle and the Nurses of the Vinebrook, the photographic exhibition Victory in the Pacific, and the special half-day symposium Interpreting Australia's Second World War, previewing Anzac Hall. The proceedings of that symposium, along with our earlier author talks, can now be viewed on the Memorial's YouTube channel. I would now like to introduce Tom Trumble. Tom has worked in journalism, policy development, and book retailing. He graduated with honours in history, and he has also studied music and journalism. His publications include Unholy Pilgrims, Rescue at 2100 Hours, and in 2020 he did the podcast Trapped. Please join me in welcoming Tom Trumble.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. And I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Carl James and the whole team here at the War Memorial for this great honour of speaking at this brilliant museum, this sacred institution, the Australian War Memorial. This is something of an honour for me to talk about the subject of this book, Rescue at 2100 Hours. That was my last one. Survival in Singapore. The perennial questions that you get asked when you write any book generally revolve around the question of why this topic and when did you come to the decision to write about it in the first place. Writing a book, of course, of non-fiction, of military history is an exacting task. For me, I can be very specific about the answers to those questions. I've been thinking about writing a book about this particular topic since 1989, when I was a 9-year-old. That was when this particular show, The Heroes, came out, which was a brilliant, slightly over-the-top dramatisation of Operation Jaywick. As you can see, it had some of the great heroes of stage and screen in Australian television and film. Cameron Daddo, Jason Donovan, Jack Thompson, I think, was in there, and the late, great John Hargraves. And as a 9-year-old, my mother allowed me to stay up late over 2 consecutive nights, much to her credit, to watch this brilliant and extremely adventurous tale of daring do and courage and much else besides. And it's no exaggeration to say that the heroes really instilled in me a fascination, not just in the Australian involvement in the Pacific War and military history more broadly, but history generally. It was, for me, the sort of gateway drug into becoming an addict of history. And I was always determined to find out more about Operation Jaywick. And so as I grew up, I read the many histories that have been written about Jaywick, about this attack on Japanese shipping in Singapore Harbour in 1943. And finally, I came across on a trip to Singapore a slightly obscure reference to an incident called the Double Tenth incident, a dreadful atrocity that was directly linked to Jaywick, which is really what the subject of the book is about. But to understand the Double Tenth, you first have to understand a little bit about Jaywick. So Jaywick was the brainchild of these two extraordinary men. On the left of screen is Ivan Lyon, an enigmatic figure. Everybody has a different view of Lyon. Those that met him, some found him superstitious, overwrought, aloof, very distant. Others saw him as charming, romantic, adventurous, and a great leader. He was also clearly quite an impulsive man, as you can see from that tattoo of a tiger that was emblazoned on his chest after a very heavy night of drinking in Serangoon Road, Singapore, with some mates. One thing that could not be disputed about Lyon, though, however, was his courage. He was an extremely courageous man. And he was in Singapore prior to the outbreak of hostilities with the Gordon Highlanders, a major in the Gordon Highlanders. And he was seconded to a highly irregular unit whilst in Singapore called Special Operations Executive, SOE. SOE had been operating in Europe from the beginning of the war. They were sometimes referred to as Churchill's Secret Army or the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. And they conducted sabotage, espionage, and reconnaissance through Europe with the instructions to set Europe ablaze, which they did to great effect. And for that reason, a unit was set up in the Far East, and people like Ivan Lyon and various other officers and enlisted men were seconded into SOE. And some of his responsibilities included training up in the main stay-behind parties in Malaya, Malayan insurgents or guerrillas as they're referred to, training them in hand-to-hand combat, small arms training and so on and so forth. He set up food dumps in Malaya when it was anticipated that Malaya would fall into Japanese hands, which of course it did. He also is reputed to have carried out assassinations of some high-level officials in French Indochina, although in the Vichy French Indochina, which has been disputed, but that is a possibility. And he also set up exfiltration and infiltration lines from Sumatra along a chain of islands that connected Sumatra through to Singapore and Malaya. He would go around and sail around those islands, meet the village headman of the local inhabitants, pay them off so that they would assist operatives, commandos, spies who were going to try and infiltrate into Malaya in the event that Malaya fell into Japanese hands. And he used that particular exfiltration line to evacuate many individuals, Europeans and British civilians in Singapore just prior to the fall of Singapore and immediately afterwards. And it was on that experience, during that experience of evacuating these people, that he would ultimately meet the man on the right. The exfiltration line, by the way, took them ultimately by boat to Sumatra, up the river Indragiri to a place called Rangat, where the evacuees would meet British parties who would take them over to the mountainous interior, to the west coast, where they'd meet British ships, or indeed south down to Palembang, where they'd be airlifted to safety, or at least that was the hope. But as I was saying, it was on the river Indragiri where he met the man on the right, whose name was Bill Reynolds. Bill Reynolds was an Australian. He was a merchant mariner who was in Singapore prior to the outbreak of hostilities as well. And to give the abridged version of Reynolds, ultimately, he sought and was given permission to take possession temporarily of an impounded Japanese fishing boat called the Kofuku Maru. And he used this vessel, which was a vessel of around 20 metres in length, a very narrow gulleted hull, as pictured here. He renamed it, first of all, the Sui Sinfar, after the British privateer, and he peopled it with a Chinese crew. And he used that vessel to effect the evacuation of, some believe, up to 150 evacuees. Again, British civilians and some Europeans as well. And he did this over several trips. As you can see, it was not a big enough boat to be able to accommodate 150 people. And what Reynolds related to Lyons that really piqued Lyons' interest was the fact that the Sui Sinfar managed to make it through areas that were absolutely choked with Japanese patrols, Japanese vessels under skies that were thick with Japanese aircraft during the Battle of Singapore and the fall of Singapore, and yet had managed to do so seemingly with impunity, as in they were left largely alone, completely alone, as it were. such was the success of those missions, Lyon thought, perhaps we can use this boat as the centrepiece of an operation to strike back at the Japanese in Singapore. The first thing he wanted to do, though, in agreement with Reynolds, was rename the vessel. They named it a second time from Sui Sin Fa to the Krait, spelt K-R-A-I-T, named after this particular species of snake on the right there. The Krait is a species of snake that is native to South Asia and Southeast Asia, and it is notable for three things. It is deadly venomous, it's lightning quick. Neither of those two things could be ascribed to that vessel on the left, as you can see, making way through some very heavy seas, rolling around like a porpoise. But the third thing that was notable about the species of snake, which the vessel shared, was that it was inconspicuous. It hid in plain sight. That was the secret of the snake's way of hunting. It would wait for prey, rodents predominantly, to come within its vicinity, hiding in leaves and on the ground like this snake here, and then launch an attack. And that was really the heart of what Jaywick was. They would use this boat to go deep into Japanese-held areas. You must remember that when the mission transpired, which was in September 1943, this was at a time when Japan held sway over one of the largest territorial empires in human history, which included more than just land. It was also a huge area of sea. And it was hoped that this vessel could hide in plain sight, like the snake, and get right into those areas. So Lyon went about securing permission, resources, and personnel to carry out this very bold and audacious mission. This is a picture that was taken after the operation, actually. Ivan Lyon there in the beret. Everyone in this photo participated in the mission itself, with the exception of Jock Campbell, second on the right there, who helped on strategy. He too was an SOE officer. The plan was to take Krait from Exmouth Gulf in Western Australia, head north, take it through the Lombok Strait, where, by the way, just prior to entering the Lombok Strait, they nearly capsized in a typhoon. From the previous photos that I showed, you can understand why. It rolled around very easily. But they made it through the typhoon and made it through the tricky currents of the Lombok Strait and then headed northwest for Singapore. At an island called Panjang, not Pong Pong, as is indicated on this map, but Panjang, 6 men disembarked. They were 6 men, I'll go back a slide. 6 men who were given 3 2-man fold boats, or folding kayaks, canoes as they call them, and these 6 raiders would then kayak over 2 consecutive nights up towards Singapore. They would make it to an island called Suba Island, which is today, as it was then, uninhabited because it has no natural water source, and it was perfect to set up as an operational post because it was about 8 miles south, directly adjacent to Singapore Harbour. Ivan Lyon here is pictured looking through the spyglass there at potential targets across the so-called Singaporean roads. So-called the roads because then, as now, it's one of the busiest sea lanes in the world. Ultimately, on September 26, 1943, the 3 fold boats set off from Suba and headed into 3 separate target areas. For those of you who know Singapore reasonably well, Pulau Belakang Mati there is actually these days called Sentosa, and this area around here is largely reclaimed land. This was one of the attack target areas for Jaywick. In the end, they would mine, with Mark I Australian mines, 7 vessels. What we know for sure, and by the way, they got out of there the next day, they set them on time-fused devices, and just before dawn the following morning, the mines detonated. What we know for sure is that 6 of those ships were either seriously damaged or destroyed. This is a subject of some controversy if there are any Jaywick aficionados in the room, but it seems that 2 ships were sunk and 4 of them were seriously damaged and all put back into service much later in the war. The 7th vessel appears to have been mined with a dud. Now, these vessels were anything from 7 to 10,000 tonnes. Not this ship exactly, but a class of this ship, this freighter, was mined and successfully sunk. The raiders then set a course back for a rendezvous point to Pompong Island, which would be anything from 60 to 80 nautical miles by kayak that they did over several nights. They went by cover of darkness because, as you can imagine, after a raid or an attack of this sort, the Japanese were sending air reconnaissance out to find out what was going on. And they stayed undercover. They kayaked by cover of darkness and island hopped their way to the rendezvous point, eventually meeting up with the Krite and then heading back to Australia. They had one last pearl-clutching moment when they were engaged by a Japanese minesweeper in the Lombok Strait. And for 15 minutes, this particular minesweeper sailed abreast or alongside them until inexplicably it peeled away and allowed the Krite to go through. They were ultimately would return to Australia to Exmouth Gulf and be feted as great heroes. This picture was taken in Brisbane several months later, or not long afterwards. Immediately after the successes of Operation Jaywick, something crucial happened that was not part of the original plan, and that is that the strategic purpose of Operation Jaywick was changed. The original purpose of Jaywick was propaganda in nature. It's important to note that removing vessels, merchant vessels of this kind, was absolutely no mean feat. And I, by the way, acknowledge this as what I regard as Australia's greatest commando operation by dint of its planning, its tactical success, and just the sheer grit and courage involved. But it was always going to be propaganda because the removal of ships of that sort was never going to seriously hamper Japan's capacity to wage war. As a propaganda mission, however, it would be a huge morale boost to not just the Australian public, but the peoples of all the allied nations. And we all know that in times of total warfare, and this stuff isn't really often spoken about enough, you need to keep morale up to support the total mobilisation of your armed forces to win the war. It would also potentially have the added benefit of sending a message to the Japanese that we have developed this military capability and there's nothing to stop us from entering into some of your other heavily defended seaports, like Rabaul, like the Philippines, like the Bay of Tokyo. What's to stop us from doing that? And that would then, it was hoped, and this is highly unlikely to have succeeded, but it was hoped that it might give rise to a rethinking about Japan's defensive strategy and pull back troops from the front line to refortify these heavily defended seaports and basically contract Japan's area of influence. However, the Australian military decided not to take responsibility for the attack. And the reason for that was because they intercepted signals that the Japanese were sending out of Singapore, alerting Japanese high command to this attack, and the conclusions that were already being drawn that the attack had in fact come from within, that it had in fact been affected by a fifth column or an insurgency. This gave rise itself to the thinking from the Australian military's perspective that let's keep this quiet in the hopes of repeating this mission, the success of the mission, and we increase the probability of success if we don't tell anyone about it. And indeed, they would attempt to repeat the mission in Operation Rimau, which Ivan Lyon himself would lead once more and would end in tragedy, but that is another story entirely. To return to Jaywick, and to understand the effect that Jaywick, as a consequence of not taking responsibility by the Australian military, would have, we first have to wind back the clock to March of 1943, several months or 5 months before the actual attack. That was the month that this man, Major, he's pictured here as a lieutenant colonel, but Major Sumida Harutsu came to Singapore. Sumida here is pictured at an anonymous location, drinking a beer with his trademark grin, variously described as sephiric, charming, angelic, disarming, and incredibly sinister. Sumida was a very senior officer in the Japanese Kempei Tai. The Kempei Tai was more or less the equivalent of the Japanese Gestapo. They took control of all of the policing of the occupied areas in Southeast Asia, throughout China and elsewhere, and it's no coincidence that so many of the atrocities that were committed throughout the Pacific War, not all of them by any stretch, but so many of them, this name keeps popping up, the Kempei Tai. They controlled those areas through intimidation, through fear, through violence, through torture, through summary execution. They were a very odious unit indeed. And Sumida Harutsu was one of their leading lights. He trained officers in the so-called arts of torture, interrogation. He'd been a career Kempei Tai officer. He enlisted back in 1929. and his star was very much on the rise. He'd been deployed to various other occupied territories as well and carried out certain other atrocities. He was ultimately brought to Singapore to bring Singapore back under control. Now, in 1943, the situation for the Japanese, for the first time since their war began in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria and northern China, Japan was experiencing reversals. Supply lines into places like Singapore, which is entirely dependent, as it is now, on the importing of supplies for that island to be sustained. Supply lines into Singapore were being disrupted and the situation was getting grim. The consequences of this, and as well as that, there was hyperinflation, there was job scarcity, there was food scarcity, and the population of Singapore was becoming extremely restless. There was an uptick in looting, there was an uptick in robberies, a factory fire occurred, there was a ship that burnt in mysterious circumstances off the west coast of Singapore as well. And the Japanese authorities drew the conclusion that this had to have been carried out by an insurgency. It felt like it was something that was planned, there was a conspiracy that was well organised, and there was also some evidence of low-level sabotage, like the cutting of telegraph wires and this sort of thing. In fact, the criminality and the looting was entirely to do with the reversals that Japan was experiencing in the war and the deteriorating situation in the Singaporean economy, rather than an insurgency. There was no organised insurgency within Singapore. But Sumida was brought in here to find this insurgency, to create this insurgency almost, if you like. And in his investigations, he was given total control of the Kempei Tai, of which there were hundreds of auxiliaries and officers, like these men, dressed here in these resplendent and rather sinister shark-tooth suits with their crisp white shirt. The man in the army uniform is wearing the white armband with the red kanji characters that you can't really see emblazoned on the white armband, which meant Kempai or law officer. And these men were deployed by Sumida to investigate this insurgency. This is, remember, prior to Jaywick. And the things that they returned to him through their network of informants that were either paid off, who were settling scores, family enmities against other Chinese groups. The Chinese community in Singapore, it's important, is not a homogenous group, but comprised of many ethnic groups, and there are tensions within that group. But by and large, the informants were forced to participate in these investigations through intimidation, through threats on their own lives or the lives of their families. And the things that were learnt in the investigation were deeply troubling to Sumida. And one name kept on popping up. This lady's name, Elizabeth Choy. Elizabeth Choy ranks, by the way, as one of the most fascinating, inspiring characters that I've ever written about in history. She was a teacher. She was born in British North Borneo in 1910. She was the eldest of 6 children. She was sent to Singapore at a very young age to get an education during the Depression so that she might be able to get a job and send back food for the family. Her father was a farmer of copra, and like everyone else throughout the empire, throughout the world, was affected greatly by the Great Depression. She excelled in her studies, and she chose as a career, she was deeply devout, by the way, she was raised in the Christian Anglican mission schools of British North Borneo, and she saw as an article of faith the idea of Christian devotion being something that would guide her decision about what career she chose, and she chose education. She chose to be a teacher, and she was a teacher of great renown. She was ultimately recruited by the principal of St Andrew's School, which is to this day one of the prestigious schools, Anglican schools in Singapore. And the principal was a man by the name of Canon Reginald Sorby Adams, which is a name that pops up a bit later. He was an Australian by coincidence. And Elizabeth Choy chose a career in teaching, and everything was going well. She had just recently been married before the war, and then war broke out in the Pacific. And like every person's life in Singapore, her life would soon be upended. Ultimately, she would choose to get a job at a canteen in a hospital. She elected to eschew the offer of working as a teacher because she didn't want to teach the Japanese propaganda that was being pumped into the Singaporean children, so she chose to work as a canteen operator. And it was in that position where she would become a key functionary in what I regard as one of the most fascinating and brilliant smuggling operations of the war. She would ultimately be approached in that position by a man by the name of John Long. And John Long was an internee in Changi Jail who drove an ambulance from Changi to this particular hospital with internees who were suffering various tropical maladies like malaria, dysentery and beriberi and so forth, and also had other injuries. And Long approached Elizabeth Choy and said, listen, if you can, try and get me some medicine, try and get me some supplies. And oh, by the way, can you smuggle some messages back and forth? Because all of these internees had contacts in the municipal area within the Chinese community. Elizabeth Choy was only too happy to oblige. Word of this particular operation, or the smuggling, spread around and found its way into the ears of this man on the far right, whose name was Reverend John Leonard Wilson. He was the Bishop of Singapore. He actually had his liberty, enjoyed his liberty in the early stages of the occupation. He would ultimately be interned in Changi and then incarcerated and caught up in the double 10th atrocity and brutally tortured and would survive. But prior to that, he was allowed to go to the POW camps and the internment camps across Singapore and provide spiritual guidance to the internees and the POWs and whatever other practical help that he could. And when he visited Changi Prison, he was approached by a self-appointed committee of internees who were effectively the advocates and the voices of the internees in Changi. And they said, Bishop, with due respect, we don't need your prayers, we need your money. They desperately needed money. And the reason for that was because they weren't getting enough food from the rations that were being doled out by the Japanese guards. This committee had approached the Japanese commandant of Changi, who was reasonably accommodating, it should be noted, and said, we need more food. We're a population of 4,000. There are 3,000 men, 700 women, the rest are children and infants, and without any more food, we will die. The Japanese commandant said, there's nothing I can do, but I'm not averse to you buying food from the Japanese guards. And of course, those guards will clip the ticket on the way through and skim a little bit off the top. In other words, I'm happy to establish a black market. But for a black market to thrive, you need money. So the Bishop of Singapore, Reverend Wilson, went back out to his community of people that he knew. He's extremely well networked, and went straight to this man here over on the left. He's facing that way. His name was Hans Schweitzer Eaton, and he was a Swiss man. And being Swiss and part of a neutral country, he therefore he could enjoy his liberty, as could his associates in the Swiss community. And Hans Schweitzer Eaton, which the bishop knew, had his own problems. He was trying to get his money out of Singapore and remit it back to Switzerland. Like anyone in Singapore, excluding the Japanese, he knew that Japan would lose the war. But more to the point, he knew that this occupation in Singapore would be dreadfully hard and have appalling economic consequences. Hyperinflation and all sorts of things would absolutely render the money that he had tied up in various investments in Singapore and businesses, and also just the money that he had in Singaporean banks, would be rendered worthless at the end of the war. He wanted to get it out of there and transfer it into francs, Swiss francs, before that happened. But there was no way he was going to do this. So obviously this is well before the advancements of electronic transfers and so forth, and currency exchanges. The bishop had a solution for him. He said, loan me the money, and I will guarantee that I will pay that back on behalf of the church. You effectively be loaning it to the Anglican Church, which probably had the best credit rating of any institution in Singapore at that time. And more than that, I'll pay it back at an interest rate of 8%. Hans Schweitzer Eaton got his crew of Swiss businessmen together, and they all put money in, and they were delighted with this solution, and they ended up giving over 400,000 Singaporean dollars that we know about. And that's a huge quantity of money. In today's money, that's tens of millions of dollars, which was piped into the various internment camps, mostly Changi Prison. By the way, Hans Schweitzer Eaton also was the Swiss representative of the Red Cross. The Red Cross was not an acknowledged presence in Singapore by the Japanese, but he self-appointed himself that so that he could go and visit the internment camps across Singapore. And he used to come in this lorry that was dubbed the Blue Angel by the internees. It was so called because it had a blue Duco, and it used to roll up through Singapore to the internment camps, and the internees would shout out, "Here comes the Blue Angel." It's because at the back of that lorry were all of the tin supplies and the equipment and the apparel of the company that he was the CEO of, which was Diethelm & Co., a trading company, an import-export business, and they had all of this material, all of this food, all of this equipment, exactly the stuff you need in an occupation, in docks, in the warehouses down at the Docklands. So Schweitzer Eaton would roll up into Changi and Sime Road prison camp, and he would sell his tin supplies and his equipment and his apparel to the Japanese guards, who would then on-sell that to the internees, who would purchase those goods with the money that he and his Swiss associates had loaned. He would have netted a very handsome profit. He emerges as something of an Oscar Schindler-esque-like character, because the reality is that however you feel about this money-making scheme, it undoubtedly saved thousands of lives. The problem, however, to go back to the bishop and the issues in Changi prison, was how to get all of that money in. It was all good and well to say, yes, I'm happy as the Japanese camp commandant to have a black market flourish, but I don't really want to know how the money gets in here, and I certainly can't have 400 grand rolling around in here, because that money could be used for nefarious means, like the purchase of munitions, like the purchase of weapons that could fund a rebellion or an insurgency. So the money had to be smuggled in very small or relatively small instalments. This is where Elizabeth Choy comes into it. The money was given to her, the bishop approached her, and through an Indian intermediary, the money was given to her in canisters, in $5,000 and $10,000 instalments, and over many weeks, for about a year and a half, would be smuggled back through John Long and his ambulance back into Changi prison. It was a masterful scheme, but it was highly, highly dangerous. And ultimately, Elizabeth Choy would pay very dearly for her part in that smuggling operation. This story about Elizabeth Choy, these reports about Elizabeth Choy, also drew Sumida Harutso's attention to the activities in Changi, and particularly to this man here, Robert Heatlie Scott. Now, Robert Heatlie Scott was a diplomat. He was a brilliant Oxford-educated Scotsman who was in China through much of the 1930s. He bore witness to the Japanese aggression. He was there in Manchuria during that invasion. He saw so many atrocities committed through Shanghai. He also saw the tensions and the all-out fighting between the communist and nationalist forces. He would ultimately be sent as part of a delegation, and the Japanese knew this, a British delegation to Japan, because he could speak not only Chinese dialects and Mandarin fluently and several European languages, he's also proficient in Japanese. He was sent to Japan as part of a delegation to appeal to moderate voices within the Japanese government to try and steer them away from war, which of course was always doomed to fail. He would ultimately be appointed to a seat in the Governor's War Council, where he would advise the governor exclusively on Japanese cultural matters. Unfortunately, they didn't take any of his advice around Japanese military capability. But his main role was as the representative, the Far Eastern Bureau's representative for the Ministry of Information. This fabulous cartoon or caricature appeared in the Straits Times, which is the major Singaporean daily, shortly after his appointment in 1940. He had essentially a role as a propagandist. And these were the three information chiefs. Those other two gentlemen reported to Scott, who's the one with the moustache. As you can see, the press, which was already muzzled, is barking questions at them, and the three men are aping these three monkeys down the bottom in response to those questions. We hear no evil, we speak no evil, and Robert Scott closes his eyes blissfully and sees no evil. That was his role. He had control of the Malayan Broadcasting Corporation, which was a very, very powerful broadcasting station, broadcast throughout Asia, particularly Malaya, obviously. And they were designed in effort to win back hearts and minds from the Japanese and their very, very successful propaganda campaign. The problem that Robert Scott would have, however, in the mind of Sumida, was that the word for information in Japanese is directly transferable or interchangeable with intelligence. So Sumida drew the conclusion that this man was not only the head of the Far Eastern Bureau for the Ministry of Information, the master propagandist, he was also the head of the Ministry of Intelligence. He was a master spy. And it was on that basis that Sumida and others concluded that he was the most dangerous man in Singapore. It was also learnt that operating in Changi were several receivers. In fact, they drew the conclusion, they being the Japanese, that they were transceivers and that they were transmitting messages and receiving signals all the way from India and taking direction from the British in India about how to carry out an insurgency in Singapore. And this information was being shared with the Chinese community through John Long's contacts, through Elizabeth Choy and her network as well. Sumida had the theory that he needed to go in and get the support to carry out a raid and carry out a series of arrests, or so he thought. When he presented his findings to the Japanese military, they said, you don't have any evidence, really. And he didn't, not yet. And then, inexplicably, on September 26, 1943, the ships in Singapore Harbour blow up. Operation Jaywick transpires. This, to the Japanese, was utterly inexplicable. This was a huge escalation to the low-level criminality that was going on and sabotage that was going on prior to this. Was a big escalation. But to Sumida, it was utterly predictable. And he said as much to the Japanese military in Singapore and was given huge resources and manpower to carry out his investigation. On October the 10th, 1943, the double 10th, which is the origin of the name, 10-10, 10 October, it's worth pointing out that October the 10th, the double 10th is a date of significance for the Chinese community in Singapore because it marks the beginning of the Wuchang uprising, which led to the fall of the Qing dynasty in China in the early part of the 20th century, and is still a day of national commemoration, and the establishment of the Republic of China, and is still, interestingly, a day of commemoration, national commemoration in Taiwan, and was very much celebrated in Singapore prior to the war. But these days it is a day of infamy, because on the 10th of October 1943, the entire prison population, or internee population of Changi Prison, was paraded on this ground, and names were seemingly at random called out, and they were pulled in for interrogation. The first name that was called was Robert Heatlie Scott. At exactly the same time as this was transpiring in the Chinese community, names of individuals were being pulled out of their houses. It actually happened the night before, in the dead of night. People were pulled out of their houses and in most cases never seen again. They too were interrogated and embroiled in this double 10th incident. Over the course of many months, in some cases years, those 57 internees that were called out would ultimately fetch up here at the YMCA, which looks in this picture like a very stately Edwardian building with some Art Deco architecture as well. It's in fact the headquarters of the Kempei Tai, and these rooms on the first and second floors were torture chambers, effectively, or interrogation rooms as the Japanese called them. Elizabeth Choy, Robert Heatlie Scott, and those other 57 British internees, as well as countless hundreds of Chinese, were subjected to some of the most appalling refinements, as the Japanese would call them, but torture imaginable, including waterboarding, including being beaten with ropes and sticks and bamboo, including being burnt with cigarettes, and in Elizabeth Choy's case, being electrocuted for two 15-minute excruciating periods on two separate occasions with a car battery and open wires. Throughout that ordeal, neither Scott and Elizabeth Choy, who were deemed to be leaders of this conspiracy, of this fifth column, ever gave up a name. They never broke from the truth, because the truth in Elizabeth Choy and Robert Heatlie Scott's case would indeed set them free. They hadn't done anything wrong, not anything serious, at least, certainly not blowing up any ships in Singapore Harbour. Had they given in to false confessions, which many of those men did, which is completely understandable, quite frankly, when you consider what torments they were put through, had they given up names, however, the investigation would have gone on for longer than the year that it did. It did, however, go for a year. In the end, 15 British internees would die as a direct consequence of their incarceration, and scores, unfortunately we just don't know the number, but scores, possibly hundreds of Chinese who were embroiled in this tragedy would also die. But ultimately they would all be exonerated. Elizabeth Choy, and I know I'm coming to the end of my time here, but Elizabeth Choy would ultimately return to the classroom and become a woman of great renown. She was celebrated in the Singaporean press. She would visit the Queen on 2 occasions. She met with the Duke of Edinburgh, as you can see there over on the left. She met the Nixons. She went on world speaking tours, but ultimately her life was in the classroom. She became the principal of Singapore's first school of the blind, and she had an extraordinary career, living to the ripe old age of 96. Robert Heatlie Scott too. This is a wonderful photo of Elizabeth Choy at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. She was Singapore's first female member of the Legislative Council, their parliament, and she was sent as a representative of Singapore. Emblazoned on this Kip Hao, I think it's called, or Chung Sam, the Chinese characters Long live the Queen and may there be everlasting peace. Robert Heatlie Scott also enjoyed a stellar career, but I won't go into all of that here today, other than to leave you with this question: the ethical conundrum of this story, which this book attempts to tackle. Was Jaywick worth it, considering all of the tragedy that transpired in Singapore? It's a question I think that we always have to visit when we consider special operations and commando operations and the collateral damage. There is no doubt in my mind that Jaywick was a legitimate mission, that the ships in Singapore Harbour were legitimate targets, but the outcomes and the consequences of it were indisputably tragic for the mainly Chinese community in Singapore. Thank you for being such an attentive audience today, and thank you so much for having me here. Thank you.
Peering out of the shadows. Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom. A fantastic amount of research and a really wonderful and a compelling story. We do have some time for a few brief questions this afternoon. If you do have a question, please raise your hand and one of our microphone attendants on either side will assist you. And if you could speak into the microphone when you do have a question, please.
Stun them into silence.
That's right. We have one here in the front.
Thank you for an absolutely brilliant talk. Really enjoyed it. I was just wondering, yes, with Elizabeth Choy, obviously she went through tremendous trauma. I wonder, did she have any lasting sort of physical or mental effects that you're aware of from, going through that terrible ordeal?
No physical traumas that were ongoing, certainly mental trauma. It's also, I didn't go into it, but her husband was also incarcerated as well, and he suffered terribly as a consequence, probably worse than Elizabeth Choy, and he never truly ever recovered, apparently, from the suffering that he endured. But the mental trauma for Elizabeth was there, and she didn't talk about her experiences like is so often the case with veterans until many, many years after the fact, and she was compelled to do so by her old boss, the principal of St Andrews, who felt that it was important to share the story of her experiences in greater detail, and she submitted to that request. She participated in a memoir which she co-wrote and also gave many interviews towards the end of her life. Interestingly, in both the case of Elizabeth Choy and Robert Heatlie Scott, they were extraordinarily magnanimous and forgiving after their experience. Elizabeth Choy refused to participate in the War Crimes Tribunal immediately after the war because she didn't, and this was in line with her devout Christian beliefs, that she didn't believe in sort of the eye for the eye kind of mentality. She believed in forgiveness, and it was time to move on, and that these men were just following orders. So she gave a very, very diluted affidavit, which was read out at the War Crimes Tribunal, the trial, and ultimately would recuperate in England for 4 years on her own before returning to Singapore and having this stellar professional life. But yes, I think the answer to that was a long-winded way of saying the answer to that question is yes, she did suffer from her experiences. Robert Heatlie Scott, just quickly, he became the ambassador for Japan, the British ambassador for Japan, and in that post actually invited Kempei Tai officers that were in Sumida's unit to a state dinner as a sort of an olive branch moment, which was a diplomatic play as much as anything. But to sit at the same table and to have dinner with the men that did those things to him, I think is quite remarkable.
Thank you, Tom. Could you just clarify for me who actually ended up in the Changi Jail and who ended up in the various internment camps, and how close were they together because they were in the same Changi area?
Yes. So thank you for that question. So the Changi complex, which incorporated the prisoner of war camps over in the Eastern Peninsula, these were repurposed, the POW camps. So when we say Changi in Australia, we have a very specific image that comes to mind of prisoners of war, armed servicemen that were captured. That was a repurposed British barracks, and the Changi Jail, which is still standing, or at least the front gate of it is still standing, but it's still used as a maximum security prison, interestingly, is where the British or European civilians were kept. And then towards the end of the war, when there was an issue around space, a whole lot of people, particularly individuals coming back from the Thai-Burma Railway, ended up in Changi Prison, which became a kind of a multi-purpose POW and internment camp. Syme Road Prison Camp was also for internees. And Outram Road Jail was where POWs were kept, but also some internees and civilians as well. I didn't do a great deal of research on Outram Road other than where it intersects with this book. Robert Heatlie Scott was in there briefly, but apparently that was the worst by far of those 4 places. Yes? What happened to Samida? He was found guilty of committing war crimes, multiple war crimes, and would be hanged in Changi Prison. And the witness for the British government was Robert Heatlie Scott, who witnessed his death. And apparently Sumida turned to him before they put the hood on his head and bowed in sort of, I don't know what to make of that, because I find him a pretty appalling man.
Thank you. I noticed that you've got a penguin imprint up there.
Yep.
What's your comments about the relationships of an author and a publisher?
My experience has been very positive. We were talking about publishing before. I had a sobering meeting with a publisher yesterday that said the book industry is in permanent decline, which is not what you want to hear as an author of books. I've been very, very lucky with Penguin Random House. I mean, they've always been really good to me, and they're a big publisher. I've had multiple publishers there. The business is contracting though, and that's problematic because now you have editors that are doing the role of not just providing the line edit and the structural edit and looking at photographs, but they're also doing graphic design, the whole works. But that's just the state of play with publishing at the moment. I hope that answers the question. Has your experience not been as positive? Oh, good. Oh, right, excellent. Okay, excellent.
Thanks very much, Tom. I recently finished your book and I found it fascinating for a number of reasons. My grandparents lived on Pittwater where Crite was moored for many years, so as a young child my grandfather would talk to me about what its role was. Clearly from reading the book, you have a great deal of admiration for Elizabeth Choy and Robert Heatlie Smith. And having read what they went through, I'm just, to put it bluntly, gobsmacked how they survived mentally, let alone physically. But more of a comment about what two remarkable human beings that they were. Their physical and mental strength was beyond my comprehension. So.
Thank you for that comment. Yeah, and I to reiterate those comments before, that was a certain sort of mystery for me how they got through it. I think in the case of Elizabeth Choy, her faith became very important, and that was something that she held on to throughout the ordeal. In the case of Robert Heatlie Scott, he seems to, one of the great breakthroughs for me as a historian is when you come across private papers that have been donated to a library, in this case the National Library of Scotland, and never looked at before. And there was a 100-page A3 typeset document that basically recounted his experiences, which was wonderful. He was such an intelligent guy. He had a novelist's eye for detail. And one of the conclusions that I sort of draw from that and talking to his family, who I also met, is that he seemed to treat the whole thing like a game, and it provided a kind of a gap. I'm not a psychologist, but I wonder if that helped him get through it. And the way he talks about it in a very matter-of-fact way, the whole experience and how he approached each interrogation to be able to withhold information. Because, by the way, he was in possession of things that might have been useful to the Japanese. He was on the Governor's War Council, so there are things that he knew, probably too late to have any effect. But he was always cautious about what he said, and so I think that kind of gamifying the experience, if you like, may have helped. But yeah, it is remarkable. Thank you.
Great. Well, that looks like we've wrapped up the questions, and just in time too. Thank you very much again, Tom, for your talk today. And can I encourage everyone, if you're looking to buy the book, The shop is up the stairs and straight ahead, and Tom Trumble will be there to sign copies of your book if you do choose to do so. Can I ask everyone to join me in another round of applause for Tom Trumble? Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, mate.